My guest today is somebody who's very special and who has the advantage of seeing economics from a historian standpoint. Thank you very much, Niall Ferguson, for joining us on ET Now. You did say previously that 2016 is going to be a tougher year for global economy than 2015 has been. Before I get into the merits of why do you say that, let me first ask you, what is it about 2016 that's worrying you?
Well, we're in the grip of powerful deflationary forces right across commodity markets, most obviously oil. A major reason for this, though by no means the only reason, is the China slowdown. I'm sceptical about the official growth number. I think it's quite a bit lower than 6.8%. And there are serious financial issues in China that probably worry me most, particularly with respect to the Chinese currency. If China does a significant depreciation this year, that's going to have big knock-on effects for other emerging markets.
You know, you're somebody who's not a big believer in what China is trying to do. You do not believe they can go out there and transform the economy. Why are you a skeptic here?
Well, I don't want to be too negative. After all, what's been achieved since 1978 in China is the economic miracle of economic miracles.
That's right.
But they are now facing some very major challenges. Economically, the transition from an export-led, manufacturing-based economy to one that is more service-dominated and consumer-led is a very difficult thing to pull off. And politically, they are a one-party state in the midst of a massive purge, which goes by the name of an anti-corruption campaign. And that creates all sorts of internal resistance. A lot of people are having their golden goose taken away as this anti-corruption campaign continues. So there's political instability to consider as well. I think China's slowdown was inevitable, but I think we all underestimated what its global ramifications would be because we kind of forgot that it's now the second largest economy in the world, and so it matters a whole lot.
All right, that's about China. Are you as optimistic as you were about India a couple of months back? What's your take on India? And what are the levers of optimism there?
Well, India has a big demographic advantage, which China clearly doesn't. India has been the tortoise to China's hare. It looked like China was going to win the race, and now India's growing faster. And I'm very excited by what's happening in e-commerce and technology generally in India. I think that there's an awful lot of good news there. That's not to understate India's challenges. We all know what those are, from red tape to infrastructure. But on my last visit to India, I came away feeling that the country was capable of growing even faster. And so even as China's slowing down, I think we can look forward to India's growth rate going up, because potentially it could be higher, it could even be double digits. You
know, that's interesting you say that, and I want to point your attention to something that a lot of economists are beginning to say, that yes, India is going to go at a faster pace than China, but as the size of the economies are concerned, India is a much smaller economy as compared to China, and which is why it can never become the global engine of growth. Do you see that change your perception?
Well, of course, India is smaller and per capita GDP is significantly lower than for the other BRICS. But if you take a 50-year view of the matter and look ahead to where India might be by mid-century, it's conceivable that it could be the same size as the United States. Some projections suggest that. So I think one has to take the view that India is better placed for the long term than almost any other country in the world.
Absolutely. Let me just turn focus now and talk to you about the U.S. economy. And you believe that the U.S. economy is indeed on an uptick, but you believe it is U.S. is not playing the role that it did play in global economy some years back, and which is why we are seeing repercussions of that. You want to expound upon that, because you almost seem to suggest here that the U.S. should police the world.
Well, the United States has been the dominant force in the world since World War II. And although President Obama wanted to dial down the American role as global policeman, somebody's got to play that role, because it's a pretty dangerous world. And I hardly need to tell an Indian audience that. I mean, the Muslim world, stretching right the way across from Pakistan and Afghanistan to the furthest west of North Africa, is in turmoil. And that turmoil shows no sign of diminishing. If anything, it's going to increase as sectarian conflicts grow, particularly in the Middle East. Now, that sort of stuff can really be very disruptive. If the United States takes the view that it's just going to focus on its own domestic issues, which it's done in the past, that generally doesn't bode well for geopolitical stability. There's also the issue of American American economic leadership. Remember, the institutions that emerged after World War II, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and so on, were in large measure American-led. The Federal Reserve is, whether they like it or not, the world's central bank.
That's right.
So what the US does economically matters a lot. Now, right now, what we're seeing is a strong dollar creating all sorts of problems for emerging markets
That's right, yes.
around the world. And I think a lot of people are wondering whether the Fed rate hike in December was a mistake not just for the US, but for the world as a whole.
Do you expect Janet Yellen, if I may, to repeat that mistake in this year? She said that there are going to be gradual hikes and there will be many more hikes this year. And given the global turmoil that the world is seeing, do you expect her to go ahead and hike rates in 2016, or do you expect at least one more hike to happen?
Well, that's the commitment that they've made, but it gets more and more implausible the worse the data from the rest of the world, and there's some bad data in the United States as well. You know, they conjured up the idea of hanging out last year at Jackson Hole. I think they could be hanging out for longer than they expected.
All right. You're not a big fan of Russia and China leading global growth. You do not want them to be the big leaders. Why are you scared of Russia and China leading the global engine of growth, and you still want US to be there as a part of the big?
Well, I'm from Scotland. We're not scared of anything. But I think we have to ask ourselves what is happening in Russia, because Russia is in deep trouble. No matter how creative Mr. Putin may be with his foreign policy, the Russian ruble is close to being in free fall. Russia's energy-dominated economy is in deep trouble. Sanctions show no immediate sign of being lifted. Things didn't work out so well in Ukraine. They may work out quite badly in Syria. You know, I see a time of troubles ahead for Russia. So there's no way Russia can provide economic leadership. It's a relatively small economy, let's face it.
I have a last question to ask of you, and this is particularly on oil, and it's a big talking point here in Davos. You're somebody who believes that Middle East will go on to roil global markets, and one of the reasons is going to be oil prices. How do you see the dynamics change? And the whole geopolitical risk is, of course, emanating from that. Iran is back to producing oil, sanctions have been lifted, and yet you have a Saudi Arabia which is very, very vulnerable.
Well, there are two issues here. One is the geopolitical issue. There's a major conflict brewing for the future of the Middle East, for future leadership or future hegemony, as the United States ceases to be a dominant player in the region. Will it be Iran or will it be Saudi Arabia? Will it be a Shiite power or will it be a Sunni power? And that conflict is playing out at all kinds of levels. It's part of the Syrian civil war, for example. It's one reason the Syrian civil war keeps going and keeps escalating. But the second point is just an economic one. There is an attempt being made to drive the price of oil down to the point that new North American producers produced by the shale revolution are put out of business. It isn't working. All that's happening is that oil's getting cheaper and cheaper, and the American producers are hanging grimly on. And this is a risky game for all concerned, because the economics of most petrostates do not work at $30 a barrel. And that applies as much to Saudi Arabia as to any others.
I have one last question to ask of you. Are you somebody who believes that world leaders and world economies and political leaders at large are not discussing global terror as much as they should? I mean, look at what's happening around the world. It's Paris one day, it's Istanbul the other, it's Indonesia the next day. Do you believe it's not getting the importance perhaps it deserves?
Well, of course, the truth of the matter is that world leaders do not have a good answer to the problem of Islamic State. As the network of jihadist terror spreads globally, it poses a fundamental challenge to a strategy of counterterrorism that was supposed to get rid of Islamic extremism by drone strikes. That has failed. And until world leaders waken up to the nature of the threat, get away from euphemisms like violent extremism for something which is clearly of religious origin, which has to do with a particular brand of Sunni Islam, we're not going to get very far. So I think there is a major problem of cognitive dissonance. I hope that will change after President Obama leaves office, because frankly I think he has played a major role in misunderstanding, misdiagnosing this problem.
What's happening in the US? Donald Trump talks about banning Muslims in some parts of the United States. And then, of course, there is this presidential campaign being also led by Hillary Clinton. Which way is the US going to go? Or become a more protectionist economy going forward? Is because that's the big fear in global markets.
Well, after every major financial crisis in American history, you see populism. Usually a few years later, this is no exception. This was very predictable. It was obvious even with the Tea Party. Trump is only one of a number of populist candidates in play. There's a populist on the left in Bernie Sanders. It's all very entertaining. It gives us a lot to talk about over dinner. But I suspect that when all is said and done, this is going to be a contest between Hillary Clinton and a relatively conservative Republican, maybe Trump, more likely Ted Cruz, or possibly and preferably Marco Rubio, and Hillary Clinton is likely to win that race.
And while it happens, it's an entertaining campaign nevertheless. Thank you very much, Niall Ferguson, for talking to us here in Davos. That's Niall Ferguson in conversation here with ET Now.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/ETNow, and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at ETNowLive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/ETNow.